Good evening and welcome to Capital Connection, where we join the dots to give you the big picture for business in Africa. I'm Arnold Segawa. On the agenda, our panel of experts will discuss whether African governments should bite the bullet and follow Rwanda's lead and place an outright ban on the use of plastic bags. In the commodities corner, cotton comes into sharp focus, and I will get the latest analysis from Harare to the question, what now for the post-election Zimbabwe? Let's take a look at the news headlines across the continent. Hello, Chris Nicole. Zimbabwe is not straying far from the headlines following that 30th of July poll.
Hello, Arnold. Political news making top headlines across Africa, obviously wielding significant influences on Capital Connection across the continent. Latest on the Zimbabwe elections, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa has asked Zimbabweans to accept the election of Emmerson Mnangagwa as president after a contentious election. But President Ramaphosa, who is also the chairperson of the Southern African Development Community, put a caveat. Should anyone have challenges, they must follow legal remedies provided for in the Constitution and the electoral law. In Mali, the main opposition candidate from Mali's July 29th election, Soumaïla Cissé, has appealed to the country's constitutional court to investigate alleged violations during last month's elections. The former finance minister, who got the second largest number of votes, has submitted evidence of malpractice to the court, which now has until the 8th of August to decide ahead of the 12th August runoff. Some sad news: Ebola is back in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo 2 weeks after it was declared defeated. The health ministry will now begin vaccinations come Wednesday using the same Merck-produced vaccines earlier applied. And some happy news for local investors in Nigeria, as Nigeria's Central Bank Governor Godwin Emefiele says banks should provide loans to institutions in employment-elastic sector of the economy at about 9% interest rate, while corporate institutions should issue long-dated commercial papers at interest rates below 10%.
Thanks for that, Christy. Now, we will be speaking with a Zimbabwe analyst in a couple of minutes. So let's leave that story on one side. This instruction to the commercial banks by Nigerian Central Bank Governor on the reduction of interest rates, does this not conflict with the central bank's recent monetary policy meeting to leave interest rates unchanged?
That instruction by Nigeria's central bank is a fallout of the MPC, where the bank ironically itself pegged the MPR, the rate at which it lends to commercial banks, at 14% for the 11th consecutive time. Currently, the risk-free rate within Nigeria as an investment environment is set to be at around 13%. Now, while the idea of a single-digit rate is definitely pleasing to investors, the central bank is yet to provide full details on how the newly proposed lending policy is expected to work.
Many thanks for that, Christy Call in Lagos, Nigeria. Now, back on the South African front, South Africa's unemployment rate worsened to 27.2% in the second quarter of 2018. There is more bloodletting to come. Mining company Impala Platinum is set to retrench 13,000 people. CNBC Africa's reporter Karabo Coletha is on the platinum belt. Karabo, what's the reaction on the ground to the news that Impala Platinum's decision is underway to cut close to thousands of jobs?
Well, Arnold, just as you put it, one of the richest platinum regions in the world, but the feelings here are very, very much of being without that richness. I spoke to a couple of people here on the ground, a couple of miners who say that they had no idea before last week's announcement that the mine indeed was looking into cutting some 13,000 jobs. They're just as surprised as we were, and that they're hoping to hear better news coming from their union representatives in the shape of AMCU tomorrow when they meet here to discuss what the outcome, what the announcement means, and where they're going further with their efforts to try and mitigate some of the job losses that have been spoken about here.
Many thanks for that, Karabo. That was Karabo Coletha. Now joining us from Harare is a researcher and analyst, Derek Matisak. Many thanks for making time to speak to us, Derek.
Most welcome.
Now, Derek, the post-Mugabe era appears to be a case of the more things change, the more they stay the same. Claims of voter rigging, state violence, intimidation of the opposition, as well as even media attacks, is straight out of former President Mugabe's playbook. Not a good advert for Zimbabwe's democratic renaissance, if I could say. Is this set to deter investors?
It's certainly going to have a chilling effect on investors. The idea of the elections was to cure the coup, as it were, that took place in November, and for the Mnangagwa administration to present itself as a legitimate and stable government. We've seen the military coming onto the streets, basically creating the impression of a militarized state. We saw the troops running amok. This is not the impression that was intended to be created in the post-election situation. So very worrying, and I'm sure of great concern to investors.
Derek, a very contentious issue was if at all this election was credible, then the IMF would come to the table, then you'd see more liquidity coming in form of the international community. Do you get the sense that enough has been done to actually warrant a facility from the International Monetary Fund?
Well, a facility from the International Monetary Fund wouldn't actually be sufficient. Zimbabwe needs a much bigger injection of cash than the kind of loan that the IMF normally gives. The real key to unlocking Zimbabwe's economy is attracting foreign direct investment, and I think the investors are going to be taking a step back after the events of last week.
Many thanks for that, Derek. And now for the Commodity Corner, and our Capital Connection correspondent, Nazi Zote, takes a look at cotton.
Let's start with the cotton conversation. So with the fluctuating prices, how is cotton faring in the continent currently?
Well, cotton production in West Africa is primarily focused on the Francophone West Africa region. So countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, Cote d'Ivoire. For years, Burkina Faso was the leader, but they had some problems with some genetically modified cotton varieties that they were cultivating, which had much shorter strands and ultimately was lower quality. They're switching back to a different variety, and that means that really Mali is the leading producer with around 300,000 tons of lint cotton this season. But we're seeing both Benin and Cote d'Ivoire hugely increasing cotton production. They're up to about 180,000 tons this season, and they could eventually overtake Burkina Faso. So certainly in terms of cotton production, it's very successful. And we see also a couple of major monopolies, partly state-owned, which are very effective at running the value chain. CNDT in Mali and Sofitex in Burkina Faso.
So you do mention production, Edward. What external factors are affecting cotton production?
Well, the key problem in Africa is getting access to inputs. This means the right kind of seed, fertilizer, pesticides, and the tools and implements that you need. And ultimately, that is lacking in many of the different cotton sectors. Then there is the weather. We have climate change, which is underway across Africa, drier weather or sometimes much more heavy rains than usual, and disruption of weather patterns. And that can really affect production. Ultimately, what the cotton sector in Africa is lacking is mitigants. So this might mean, for example, insurance for the crops. This is something very rare. Often the logistics is poor, ability to store the cotton so it doesn't get damaged, and ultimately access to finance as well. I think all of this means that what you need is a properly managed value chain, which runs from seed to shelf. And ultimately, we've seen that partly achieved in some countries in West Africa, but in too many other countries, Cote d'Ivoire, Cameroon, and also in East Africa, it can be very fragmented, the cotton sector, and that makes it very difficult for farmers to get their goods to market.
Definitely, I'm sure it is. And what does this do to the mid to long-term prices for cotton in the market?
Well, we've seen a real increase in cotton prices over the last 2 years. After bottoming out in 2014, they reached to a peak in May. And that's because that we've actually seen 3 successive seasons where demand has increased globally. We're going to see the 4th successive cut in global stocks as well. And if you also factor in the fact that China and India, 2 of the largest producers, are forecast to reduce production next season, that's been bullish for prices. But then in June and July, we've seen a slump. They've gone back to about 88 cents a pound. And that is because of the potential or ongoing trade war between the Trump administration and in particular China. China has become a very important importer of American cotton and was increasing its imports. And this is one of the areas we could see where the trade war and tariffs could really badly affect it. This has really spooked the markets, and that has brought prices down. But I think ultimately cotton is in a strong position for prices because we are seeing so much rising global demand. And even China is starting to run down its record stocks of over 10 million tons. So I think the medium to long-term outlook for prices is that they should hold on to the gains they've made over the last 2 years. But the trade war has definitely spooked markets. And if we are going now into the silly season, when there is less news on while people are on holiday, we could actually see quite a bit of volatility in cotton prices up until October when the new season has started across the world.
Many thanks for that, Nazi. Now, coming up after the break, is it time to ban plastic bags from Africa? All that after the break. Welcome back to Capital Connection. Now, an estimated 5 trillion plastic bags are produced annually. This is according to the environmental group Ocean Watch. Each bag is only used for an average of 12 minutes before being discarded. Now, joining us to discuss the pros and cons of banning plastic bags in Johannesburg is Environmental Affairs Professor Tracy-Lynn Humby of the University of the Witwatersrand Law School. Right next to her, we do have Anton Hanekom of South Africa's industry body, Plastics SA. In Kigali, Rwanda, we are joined by the Director General of Rwanda's Environment Management Authority, Coletha Ruhamya. And in Lagos, Nigeria, we have an environmentalist, Bilikiss Adebiyi-Abiola. Many thanks for making time, gentlemen and the ladies. Let me start with you, Anton. Many a times we do see the public end of things, the government doing so much, at least to push this agenda. It does look good on paper to do away with plastic bags, but when push comes to shove, it many a times just remains rhetoric. Tell me, how is South Africa on this particular front?
I think there's a lot of discussion around the possibility of banning plastic bags in South Africa as well. My view, that is not the correct way to go. It doesn't solve the problem. It's in fact just replacing one product with another one. If we're serious about the environment, I think we need to sit around the table, discuss the various options, discuss and look at life cycle assessments over the period, and then come to a conclusion and a decision that is not only beneficial for the environment, but will also have an economic impact and growth and job opportunities for citizens of South Africa.
Professor Humby, many a times, I just want to get your views from what he's actually saying. Lots of talk, but when it actually comes to putting forward policies, that's where we see this lag. What can be done, at least from for the legal reform?
So I think it's important to ask the right question. And we have an issue of plastic bags and we have an issue of environmental degradation, and there are a number of discourses going around. So there's, on the one hand, the discourse of the UN and the Clean Seas campaign and the recognition that plastic bags and other plastics pose a global threat. And then you have a national discourse, particularly in Africa, around the harm that it causes here. So I don't think there's a shortage of policies. And I don't think that in some places there's a shortage of legal reform either. I think the problem comes with the enforcement, with the implementation, and with implementing a range of measures that are going to advance behavioural change. And then the question is, does that behavioural change actually benefit the environment? So there are a number of questions we need to ask before we get to a solution that's sustainable for people and planet.
Fascinating insights indeed. Let's take it to Lagos. Bilikiss, just across the border in Ghana, we are seeing something that Professor Humby here is going on about, how the behavioral change actually fits into this particular discourse. And sandals are being made from plastic and this kind of move towards a more environmentally friendly ecosystem. Give me a sense of where we stand in Nigeria right now.
I think we still have a long way to go, because I think the main issue is that we have to understand that the plastic industry has been very established over the years. There are many people that actually have jobs within the plastic industry. And so for the government to just ban it will be a knee-jerk reaction. There has to be a very sustainable policy where initially you begin with disincentives, where you try to get people to change their behavior. For instance, you can have introduction of tariffs where people have to pay a little bit of money to use the plastic bags. And then you work with the plastic bag organizations, the companies that make them, to look for sustainable alternatives to using plastic bags. So I think in Lagos, we all understand the big issue that we have. The government is awake to the problem, and the government is working on the solution. But I think it's something that has to be done, you know, in tandem with everyone, with all the stakeholders. Right.
Let's take the conversation to Kigali. Coletha, Rwanda is one fascinating country where there's kind of a zero-tolerance policy. If you're crossing the border from Tanzania, entering Rwanda, they ask you to actually leave your polythene bags and plastic bags right at the border. Do you get the sense that the rest of sub-Saharan Africa needs to follow in this kind of footsteps that Rwanda has actually moved towards?
Maybe I give a bit history of how we banned the plastic bags. We first did a study that was back in 2003. And then we realized that we could live without plastics, or maybe on the principle of reduce, reuse, and recycle. That's when the cabinet decision was decided on. That was back at 2004. And then we had cabinet directives. And then that's how we started sensitizing our people, because the issue of plastic waste was actually taken as a country problem. And we could indicate on our community how the issue of plastic waste, because they were all scattered all over. They had environmental issues, they had aesthetic issues, because all over it was waste scattered, blocking the water drainage, causing some floods, and the like. So then in 2008, we introduced the plastic ban law. But from 2004, we tried to sensitize our people to indicate how bad the plastic is. And we realized that people could live without plastics in some of the areas. Right. And that's how people started buying in, because through sensitization and through cleaning, through Muganda, that was done once a month, and people could collect so many plastics and indicate how plastic waste are affecting our economy, our environment, and actually aesthetically displeasing.
Right, fascinating indeed. Let me just bring it back to the studio. Professor Humby, maybe this is something that need be done. I'm not a big fan of a copy and paste kind of approach, but if this is working in one country, who's to say that maybe it wouldn't in another?
So what do we want to achieve? And why do we want to do it, and how do we want to do it? So at an international level, there is increasing traction to develop some kind of international framework. December last year, the United Nations Environmental Assembly passed a resolution, which African countries have subscribed to use plastics responsibly and to reduce the use of unnecessary plastics. So at an international level, there's going to be some sort of obligation on African countries to do something. But the question is, what do you do? And do you use a plastic ban as a silver bullet to try and solve the problem? I don't think so. I think, as Coletha has indicated, there's a raft of measures that you need to implement, and you need to consider how plastics are being used, particularly by poor people.
Bilikiss, let's take it back to Lagos. No need for a plastic bullet, rather, a silver bullet. Where's my head? No need for a silver bullet there, like Professor Humby here has mentioned. You touched on a very interesting issue here on tariffs maybe that could actually be introduced. But let's move away from the copy and paste. What other prescriptions could you have here?
I agree. I don't think there's a copy and paste solution. I mean, in Lagos, in Nigeria, for instance, one of the big sources of plastic is actually pure water. So pure water is just the cheaply bagged water that people drink, and it's all over the place. And there are companies that actually recycle the pure water bags into plastic bags. So I think for a country like Nigeria, there has to be a decision around, okay, do we want to continue to have pure water usage? Also, we have to talk to the companies that recycle these pure water and see how they can turn and change their end products away from these plastic bags that are causing a nuisance to the environment.
Interesting insights there, Bilikiss. Anton, let me bring you in here. You mentioned something before we came on around behavioral change to start with. Just maybe expound more on this for our viewers.
I think part of the elephant in the room is how we deal with the waste at the end of the day. And I think over years we've become used to the linear economy model where we have this mentality of throw away. And that's part of the behavior. So anything that we do, even if you look at alternatives or you look at different ways of structuring it and reduce it, at the end of the day, a lot of the environmental problems that we sit with is due to human behavior. It's not a product. I haven't seen a bottle jump out of the trolley and ran to the river and to swim. It's how we deal with the waste that we've used or the products that we use. So it's that responsibility, it's the respect for the product and for myself. And I think that's something that we need to do. So whatever we do, and there's probably a multitude of things that we need to do, but does it change behavior at the end of the day, and do we take responsibility for our products?
Professor Humby, something that's been eating me up since we sat here is the fact that some governments actually do not recognize that the globe is actually heating up maybe by 3 degrees every year, and the dire nature of what we're actually going on about. Do you get the sense that the legislation reform is taking the back seat? Because let's face it, maybe many of the legislators are not looking at it as seriously as it should be.
There are many problems, of which plastic bags are just one, and they are a significant problem. You know, I think it's important to realize that people have described the plastic pollution in the ocean as an ocean Armageddon. There are trillions of microplastic particles in the ocean, so it's something we need to pay attention to. But certainly people are taking action now, governments are starting to take action. I just think that there hasn't been a lot of research done on whether plastic bans actually lead to behavioural change, although there is research that people don't change the behaviour unless there's a stick, not just a carrot.
Right, I think before we sign off, let's head over to Coletha. Coletha, lots of talk about the economic impact for the business as it is, at least what Rwanda could be missing out on, or recycling as it is. Do you get the sense that maybe the con of not having plastic in the country as it is, in the economy as it is actually depriving Rwanda of the much needed revenues?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think the economic impact previously, when we started, people thought people would be losing jobs and the effects to the business, but I can assure you actually it was economic gain. If you look at the alternative packaging materials that were produced, and that was creation of jobs. So currently we have about 3 companies that are doing manufacturing alternative packaging materials. We have 5 companies that are working on recycling of the plastic waste. Of course, as you ban the plastic materials, but we still need some plastic in some areas, like agricultural activities, where we use for tubing, we use for collection of wastes, we use for construction purposes. So we still recycle some of the plastics, but I can assure you it was actually economic gain. Whether others could think it is actually the economic failure, where we thought people would be losing jobs, for those who have invested in plastic material companies and those who were involved in trades. Right. But eventually we got alternatives, and that also triggered the innovation in our private sector.
Right, many thanks, Coletha. I'm afraid that's all the time that we did have. Many thanks to my guests, and do join us again on Wednesday at 6:30 p.m. That's Central African time, where we will be discussing the economics of remittances. Have a good night.